Welcome, everybody, to the first ever dual author interview. I've brought in two of my current faves, Nicholas EAMES and Evan Winter. How are you guys doing today?
Good.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, it's amazing you guys are willing to do this. I appreciate it. It's a bit of an experiment, but I'm two of the voices I respect most going on in fantasy right now. So I want to get through some questions, some thoughts and opinions. And first and foremost, I also want to say you both have upcoming releases. So let's get the plugs going, because I'm not going to be one of those people who holds it at the end hostage. We have both of you are releasing sequels, and Nick, it's your case, it's the third book, and Evan, it's your sequel to Rage of Dragons, correct?
Well, mine, The Fires of Vengeance, is November 10th. Originally July 16th, and then due to unforeseen circumstances, aka I didn't write fast enough, November 10th.
I wouldn't know anything about that not writing fast enough thing. And therefore, my dates are completely unknown.
Every author I've talked to about dates has said they love the sound of them flying by. They don't get them, so fair enough. Well, I asked my audience some questions for you guys to talk about your writing experience, your publication experience, and just getting a rather fun one out of the way, completely unrelated to all of that. You are now both evil fantasy villains with unlimited funding. What is your evil lair like? I'm dying to know.
Evan, do you want to start this one?
Oh no, I think this is all you first. I feel like.
Okay, well, I'll tell you this: there's going to be a lot of monitors. I think monitors, especially in the modern age, is pretty key to a bad guy's lair. If
just cameras watching random streets.
Yeah, you got one monitor on. They're just like, what are you doing? You're just Netflixing here. So you got to have many monitors with just video games on them. I'm not going to be like CCTVing anyone or looking at my security cameras. It's just video games.
Love it. Yeah, I feel like as unoriginal as this may be, probably that old-fashioned European castle with a moat. Always wanted to have a moat. I feel like that just sends that right, you're not welcome message to anybody who sort of approaches. And, fill it with a couple of random animals, alligators or sea serpents, a moat. You definitely have to have a moat.
Personalize your moat by adding whatever you want to it.
Yeah. You are a fantasy author. You can take it in any direction you want.
It's just filled with waiting drafts.
Oh, love it. And that's where you really show your personalities and how you populate the moat.
And the enemy stands there going like, what the F is this with the drafts? And then by then you've riddled them with arrows.
See?
So it's done its job.
See, I was thinking like the skeleton of a dead like Goliath or something, but I guess I would too over the top. It feels like I'm compensating now as opposed to your rather
hold on.
functionary.
Hold on. Taking notes. One second.
So what I actually wanted to get up front here that I thought was a nice question is about how you guys create your characters. So I've actually asked both of you guys something similar before in previous interviews, and you gave fairly different answers. So a discussion around the crafting of characters. And I think, it's probably not consistent. I'm sure sometimes you're in the pool and you get inspiration and then you jump out of the pool, whereas other times you're nice and sitting and writing. But when it comes to how you've crafted characters, Nicholas, if you'd like to start this first with your the band, I mean, how did you kind of figure out the chemistry and dynamics between those two? Was it more of an exploratory process or is it really planned out?
With mine, the first book, at least, Kings of the Wild, is the characters are modeled after the exact members of a band. So I tried to make their personalities, at least in the most general sense, represent the kind of the cliches of those characters. So Clay, the main character, is the bassist. So he's kind of the quiet, the spine of the band that, you don't really notice him. But if you take the bass away, you're like, what? The song loses its heart. And then obviously the leader, Gabriel, is kind of the flashy lead singer, the talker. And then they've got their axe man, which is Ganelon, who represents the lead guitarist, the guy who kind of carries them and does like all the flash and murder. And then there was Matrick, his last name is his nickname, I should say, is Skull Drummer. He fights with two knives, often shirtless. So he kind of represents the drummer of the group. And then, goes missing for days at a time. He would have had a pretty awful youth. And then Moog is kind of like the guy that is, serves whatever purpose necessary, the keyboards or pyrotechnics or the xylophone or the triangle. He's that guy you see jamming away on the synthesizer. So I think each of them in the end, I think each of them represents their character pretty well. Moog's pretty, literally anything can come out of his hat. You don't know what he's going to do in a fight, whereas everyone else is going to kind of play their roles. And there's even a scene at near the end in the final battle of Kings of the Wild where they're fighting in a group, and I tried to describe it, like make sure Clay was on Gabriel's right, Gamelon's on his left, Moog's in the middle of them, and Matrix behind, just to make it seem exactly like a band, the classic band setup. And then with the second book, it was more like each character represents a genre of 80s music. So Rose is kind of the punk rock, Brune is the metal, there's Akira, who's literally named for the Cure. The main character is kind of a mix between Journey and Stevie Nicks, and then Free Cloud's kind of like pop. And so I think too that eventually, like, if someone reads it with that in mind, they can read it without it in mind and hopefully not realize that they're based on genres of music. But if they read it with that in mind and listen to maybe that kind of music with those character scenes, then I think it works out pretty well. And I don't think it subtracts from their characters.
And for some of the interband drama, were you looking at like real life instances of how bands split up, or was it more, yeah?
Definitely, so much so. I mean, with both of them, I watched a lot of just rock documentaries. In the first one, obviously, you get that cliche of like one of the band members, in this case, the lead singer, meeting a woman that distracts him from what everyone else thinks is the priority. And in the second book, actually, though, is a huge inspiration for me was the relationship of Pat Benatar and her husband, who is her lead guitarist. And, she was just like a smoke show in the 80s, and he was her guitarist, and he was just like a cool, lean, like a Free Cloud, so much based on him. And they fell in love when they met, and they were just together the whole time. They didn't have any, like, as far as I know, any, like, they weren't having crazy sex with anyone who came within their circle, unlike Fleetwood Mac. But so they were just madly in love. So I used that basis, and they still are madly in love to this day. So I use that basis for those characters. And
in contrast, you have more of this party-based fantasy with Kings of the Wild, and over with Rage of Dragons, there's much more of a singular focus on one character who's kind of going through this adventure. So how did you also still develop Evan, some other characters really well alongside him. How did you kind of navigate sharing the spotlight where it's his story, but you're still building these characters around him to be, forefront enough to feel real?
I think that what I was mostly doing is I outline heavily. So a lot of what the different characters are almost the physical manifestations of the types of themes that I'm trying to discuss or tackle. And so they all end up being sort of ciphers for me to ask the different questions that I want to ask. And I always keep saying that I don't have any of the answers, but when I sort of have that cipher, someone from whom I can see the world, who maybe asks those types of questions, it helps me understand a little bit better what I'm doing, how I see the world, how what I consider to be the human condition overall. So they're all different. They're all, like in my master document, they all are sort of represent different questions that are being asked of the different themes that are traveling throughout the whole sort of narrative.
So you say you're such an organized writer, and it makes me so jealous every time, because I just have documents scattered. And would you say you're more organized as well, Nicholas, or are you kind of more just free form as it goes?
No, I don't have documents to scatter. Once in a while, I'll get ambitious and go buy a big sheet of Bristol board. Or probably has other names, but yeah, just giant white, cardboardy type thing, and I'll make like a giant web of information on there for myself.
So we have people, so in the whole like plotting versus just kind of go with it, we have two different approaches here. Have you guys tried the other, have you tried to be more organized, Nicholas, or have you tried to just kind of roll while you write, and how has that experience gone for you if you've tried to break the pattern? I
think I've just talked about trying it, but never actually tried it. Yeah, no, I'd be really interested to see someone else's notes, someone who is a heavy plotter, to see their notes, to see what kind of stuff they do, how bare bones they leave it, how much they flesh out then, and how much their document changes by the end. How much do you write down, Evan?
Yeah,
20% of the final document is notes. So 500-page book means 100-page notes, and it doesn't change that much. It stays very sort of consistent. And again, it's not like I'm doing it out of laziness, to be honest with you, because I remember from university, I
Tell me more.
Yeah, right. I despised going back and redoing work. So the way around that for me, as I got into this, was just trying to plan it out as much as possible, so that I would not have to go back very many times and sort of rewrite or redraft major sections. And so far for the two books, it has worked out that way, where I don't have to drop entire sections or entire characters or change massive things. But I'm just front loading the work, like, you know. So it's not like I'm actually saving any work. I don't think I'm just front loading it. Whereas somebody who maybe is more of a pantser develops the core idea, and it's a little bit rougher, I imagine, and then they sort of shape for a longer time. So they're backloading it. I mean, that's how I think of it anyway.
So it's the intelligently aiding your laziness is what you're going for. It's avoiding work through like planning it out, which I appreciate. I really wish I was like that. I'm much more with Nicholas here, where I just open a Word document and just start slamming my hands on the keys, and whatever happens. But another one here is so this is actually something I've never had the courage to ask authors about, because I don't want to like get too deep into this, but Nicholas, you and I have talked about this a little bit before, but how have you handled disagreements with your editors, or, you know, some beta readers where they have an opinion and you think, no, that's wrong, I want to take it this direction? How do you handle that situation? And do you have to like really sit back and say like, okay, do I need to really rethink this core concept, or no, they're wrong, it's my story? Like, how do you approach that?
Well, that's a great question. Is that yours, or did someone ask that?
That's one of my patrons asked that. I have a smart bunch.
For me, I mean, I've definitely learned to listen to people a lot when I write. I tend to change almost, I don't want to say almost everything people suggest, but I make a lot of changes because I want, you know, to write a book that makes people happy. And obviously, you know, there's things that I'll stick to my guns on. In the first book, we might have talked about this too. There was a lot of pushback against the silliness and Moog's character in general. And so scenes like when they're walking 5 abreast and Moog trips and everyone falls over him, you know, that was like, this has got to go. And I'm like, oh no. So there was a few things like that, but in general, I do like tend to look at editors' notes and do whatever they ask. There's been a couple times. There was once when I was really, I can't remember what it was, something really petty, but it was a disagreement me and my UK editor had about something, not like, we weren't like at each other's throats, just like, oh, I think this. And I took it to Twitter. I shouldn't have done that because I was wrong. And I was stupid and she was right. And I'll never do it again. I can't remember what it was, but now I joke about her all the time. I'm like, oh, well, I'm rolling over on this one. Otherwise, it's just small cases where if I put a song lyric in or something like that, or not song lyric, but like something that's in reference to a lyric and it gets edited, I'll usually try to push back against that, only because I'm like, it has to be phrased this way, just in case 1 out of 2, 100,000 people get it. And
how about yourself, Evan? Are you again in contrasting with Nicholas here, where you're fighting back right and left, or are you more, open to the feedback?
I try very hard to be as open as possible, because I think that almost every perspective when someone comes to a story, if they read something and they have a problem, their problem's legitimate to them. Like, it's a legitimate problem that they're facing, and it's just about, can I figure out why that problem is occurring for them, and do I agree that that is a problem for me as well? And if I guess if I didn't agree that it was a problem for me, I would push back and say, I understand, and there is value in what you're saying, but given what my goals are, it's not the same priority level for me, or it doesn't aid where I'm trying to go. All that said, my editor's Breet from Orbit, and she has been marvelous, and all of her suggestions, I think I have taken every single one so far over 2 books, I believe. And that's a good feeling, because she is very, very supportive of the vision that I have for the book, and she sees it in the same way. And one of the big concerns I had when I was self-publishing, coming into traditional publishing, was that a traditional publisher comes in, they buy the right to distribute the book, and then they also basically are kind of buying the right to change your story to better fit what they want. And my experience so far, and I have no idea if it's everyone's experience, but my experience so far has been that Orbit and Breet have attempted as best they're able to help me tell my story to the best that it can be, as opposed to trying to change it to being something else. And so that was a big fear of mine, a big one, and sort of really made me hesitant to even jump into the traditional pond, so to speak. And it was unfounded. So, in my case, it's unfounded.
Yeah, it should both be noted that we have Orbit editors who are unbelievably, intelligent, kind, thoughtful, funny, patient. Did I say patient? They're just amazing people.
So when you're trying to write a book and finding your own style, are you trying to develop that completely independently, or are you definitely looking to your inspirations and saying, oh, I love how they do this, let's take that? Or are you just very on your own? Evan, let's have you here. Like, how did you find, because you write, I want to say Rage of Dragons is one of the most passionate books I've ever read. It can read just angry, but in a good way, in a very good way. So I'm trying to find, like, how did you find the ability to write with such strong emotion?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that all of that passion, all of that feeling exists within me, and within sort of frustrations that maybe the way that the world is versus the way that maybe I think that it either could be or should be. So a lot of that comes from within, and you have to kind of repress it because you can't move through the world with that much anger on the surface. They tend to lock you up if you do that kind of thing. So
especially if you have a spear in your hand.
Yeah, exactly. It's not a good idea. No weapons and anger, bad mix. So I think that a lot of it is sort of me speaking to my truth. Now, again, I tend to be very sort of more subjective than objective about a lot of stuff. So these are my truths, and I believe that if I speak them as honestly as I can, there's hopefully going to be a connection with other people who can go, I recognize that someone is speaking truth to me. Now, whether their truth or not doesn't even matter as much. I recognize that this person is speaking as purely from their heart as possible. They are saying what they believe. They are asking questions that matter to them. And if you ask and do that as honestly as possible, again, my hope is that there is a connection made because people can feel that honesty and that passion behind it. So yeah, and I think I forgot the second part of the question, but that was sort of the passion part anyway.
No, I think you answered it very well. And yeah, I think I hopefully can say the same thing about you, Nicholas, where you clearly write from a place of passion, even just the way you write about the music and the lyrics and the references. I mean, this is stuff you clearly love and care about. It's also a very bold decision. I think I saw someone on Twitter pointing out that there's like a reference from Dumb and Dumber in one of your books and stuff like that. Yeah. That's brave to do. And I just want to know, like, did you have a lot of moments where it's like, no, I can't do that? Or is it just like, I'm doing it? And how did you like jump off that edge? And it worked. I mean, I love it. It's such great personality, but it's, for lack of a better, it's ballsy.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I find it, I don't know how people write without Dumb and Dumber references. I wrote a book before this one it was a very different book. If you take the most emotional parts and the parts that are like, quote unquote poetic of my books, that's kind of what it was, but it was like trying to do that for 500 pages or longer. And this book, I felt I just wrote it. Like Evan said, honestly, I wrote it like in my own voice. So yeah, sometimes my own voice is really mushy and sad and tries to be a bit poetic, but often my own voice says really juvenile things. And just makes jokes constantly. And I think, Kings of the Wild is technically, people call it like a book that's filled with humor kind of thing. But I think a lot of fantasy books have less humor than real life probably has on a day-to-day basis, just because, I don't like, maybe my family's a bit twisted, but something tragic happens to us, it's the jokes just come flying left, right, and center. So yeah, it's exactly the same as Evan. Just write it honestly, write your characters honestly. If they're, a character that might resort to humor in that situation, then go for it.
I've actually often wondered about why there seems to be such less humor in fantasy worlds. I think this is my conspiracy brain. I think it might be a little bit tied to the fact that people think like their humor didn't exist back in the Middle Ages or ancient Rome, stuff like that. When if you look at it, no, it did. Like there's like penis graffiti all over ancient Rome and like butt jokes like that's been around forever. So I think there's this misconception that makes people think that we need to like mute humor when going back in time, but that's just not the case. Humor wasn't invented in the 80s.
Yeah, I think it could be like a holdover from things like Tolkien, who wrote with such stoicism. A lot of old fantasy was so stoic and the characters were so stoic that people kind of emulated them, not maybe meaning to. And so nowadays we've got a lot of writers all around us that are writing stuff that are, a lot more honest characters and funny characters and vulnerable characters.
You see, some of the fantasy I'm most interested in is from authors who will admit they've never read Lord of the Rings. Because, okay, maybe you should read Lord of the Rings, but I also just appreciate that influence isn't there. You're going to do something different because that's not looming over you in a way.
Like imagine Frodo had walked out of Rivendell and Gandalf's like, which way is it? He's like, how the would I know?
Evan,
it could have been a lot of fun.
Have you not read Lord of the Rings?
Never read Lord of the Rings.
Respect it. I respect it. There you go.
What was your first fantasy book that you read, if I could interject?
Yeah.
Like that got you into...
First would be tough. I think that, I mean, I started with the kind of the Roald Dahl, and those are fantastical but not fantasy, and burned through. That was when I first got like hardcore. I'm like, I'm reading books. When I was very young, and I was like, I'm loving these amazingly sort of fantastical types of stories. The actual true fantasy might have been that I got into, I guess, Dragonlance, and then I didn't know that there was a sort of expanded world, and I just read in standalone or something, and I was like, okay, this is interesting and very good, but like, and then I got turned on to kind of Forgotten Realms somehow. And Crystal Shard was one of the first memories, I guess, and then burned through all the Dritz books. And I mean, let's be honest, my character dual wields because Dritz dual wields.
Nice.
And and so burned through those, and then kept going from there. But so R.A. Salvatore is probably one of the one of the first really sort of gateways to fantasy that I had.
Daniel, you should answer this too.
Yeah.
My dad read Harry Potter to me before when I was like barely able to walk, because yes, I'm a child. And then Lord of the Rings was quick after that, then Wheel of Time, and then His Dark Materials was actually huge for me. That's what actually really changed my view of fantasy, because I thought it was just this medieval or wizard witch type thing, and then I got into His Dark Materials, which showed me it can be drastically different than what you've ever thought, and that kind of really shifted my mind into being like, I want fantasy that does anything. That's why I'll look to Stephen King. I'll look to anyone who's writing fantastical elements, and I like digesting that because it's just okay. It's still in the genre in my mind. But now you can't get out of answering the question, Nicholas. What about you?
Yeah, mine was Clan of the Cave Bear. Just kidding. But I did read those books. my mom had them on the shelf. I mean, mine was actually Lord of the Rings, 100%. But yeah, I read Clan of the Cave Bear for the sex scenes. Let's not fool anybody. But and then and then when I was a young like teenager, it was Dragonlance. Those books, the Dragons of Autumn, Twilight, Dragons of Winter, Dawn. Still, they're amazing titles with amazing covers.
See, okay, Evan, you admitted not reading Lord of the Rings. I'll admit I've never touched Dragonlance in my life. It's never come across my table. And people, when they hear that, scream at me. So.
We all miss everything. I haven't read His Dark Materials, so
this is kind of that on Twitter. There's that competition happening right now around the idea of canon, book canon, and what do you need to have read? Do you need to have read anything? And what really is canon at all? And we're all sitting here talking about different sort of entry points. And sometimes they do this and they cross over a little bit. But three people who love science fiction and fantasy, and we're all kind of have different ways of looking at what fantasy starts as and what it continues to be. And I found that to be the most interesting part of the canon discussion, is that canon is just where you come from and what you read. And if you read a fair amount in your genre, you're going to have a sense of what it is that appeals to you in that genre. And then hopefully if you want to create, you can create from that as a starting point. It doesn't have to come from any particular starting point. You just need a point, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I am more interested, as I said, to just read from authors who are not pulling from the same influences that Jordan did. I love Jordan, but okay, he did his version of Lord of the Rings. I've read 1,000 versions of Lord of the Rings. Let's go. So that's why I think Jade City was so impactful to me. It just felt completely outside the box. It was so personality filled, so different, like a crime syndicate fantasy clan. Awesome. I'm here. I make the statement that fantasy is more interesting now than it's ever been. I think there are, like, don't get me wrong, there's been great fantasy since day one, all the way back to Beowulf and Greek mythology. But things are happening so rapidly and so different constantly that I'm more interested to pick. Like, I recently tried to read a classic, The Bulgarian, and it was fine, but it was not, there was not a single word that surprised me the whole way through, because I was like, this is just going through what we expect. Now, there are more classic stuff that can surprise you, like Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. It's a little bit outside the box. It's still going to be interesting and different. But how do you feel about people who are including into the genre right now? How do you feel looking at your peers who are also bringing in stuff that are just kind of from all over the place? Is it a little intimidating, or is it just kind of like, oh, there's always new inspiration around you?
I find it, thanks. No, I find it it's extremely exciting. Like, it feels so fresh and different. Like, when I was growing up, there was not really, there's not really stuff like, I don't know, at least to me, I couldn't find stuff like Joe Abercrombie's First Law series in the way that read and the way that it turns tropes kind of up on their heads. I didn't really experience that. Now, like you said, Fonda Lee's Jade City, which, congrats. It's now apparently being in development at, I think it's Netflix, right? For TV shows in development. So huge congrats to Fond du Lis. That's amazing. And to imagine getting the chance to see that and grow up with that as a TV show as a kid today, right? Where the majority of the cast is going to be East Asian, and it's this story about a world that you don't often get to see. And think of how that gets to impact new people growing up in terms of how they view fantasy and what they think of fantasy kind of places. It's not just medieval Europe or England. It gets to be anywhere, right? And I think that's such a powerful and awesome thing. So like you said, Daniel, fantasy nowadays is in an amazing and incredible place, and you can read about anywhere in a way that I think you couldn't quite as easily do, a decade ago.
I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, obviously, you couldn't even argue that fantasy isn't better, I don't think, now than it was 10 years ago, by far than it was 20 years ago, simply by like the fact that there's so much diversity now and so many more voices and so many more perspectives, most importantly on characters, and you get all these settings that you never would have imagined, and just an authenticity to all these stories, and I think they're more emotionally honest these days than they were back then too. Like we talked earlier about this, the lack of humor and the stoicism. Like you get characters like Gideon the Ninth, who, they're hard on their sleeve kind of characters, and you wouldn't really have had them back then. You certainly didn't have them in Dragonlance. They didn't really break down ever, those characters. Whereas I find in modern fantasy, you'll get really characters that go through and look at their emotions as opposed to just swinging an axe at people that they disagree with.
I really want to see Gideon the Ninth pulled out of her story and just dropped in Lord of the Rings now. And just see what
it'd be amazing.
So I want to mention a bit of an anomaly here that happened apparently to recently you, Nicholas, where on Twitter you said you were surprised to see your book had been translated and made to an audiobook in a language you weren't aware of. Yeah. How did that happen? And how do you just wake up one day and you're like, oh, this is in a language I didn't think it was yet? Cool. Like, what? Do you know how that happened yet?
Yeah. Usually you get the rights person at Orbit, in my case at least, will email you and your agent and be like, hey, these people made an offer. I don't think you can say no, but they make it pretend like you can. They're like, it's for this much, blah, blah, blah. What do you think? And I'm like, great, cool. And that's usually how it happens, for me at least. And because Orbit owns the world rights, I should say that too. So it's different if you're selling your own rights to different countries. So Orbit owns my world rights. So they kind of are the people in charge of that. And so, yeah, even just today, I saw at the same time I found there's a Russian audiobook, which I didn't know there was. I saw that coming out soon, I think it's September or something like that, is I forget what it's called, a book something, but it's the kind of audiobook that has music in the background.
Oh, yeah.
So there's an edition of that for Kings of the Wild coming out. And I had no clue. I was like, wow, what's this? My mom's going to love it.
Evan, so you've had Rage of Dragons translated, I believe, to a few languages now. How's that process gone for you? Is it kind of strange to be like, here is a version of my book I will never understand? Like, how does that kind of like...
Yeah, I mean, early on in the process. So yeah, there are people who are doing that at the moment. I haven't seen anything yet, and that will be kind of strange because everyone's doing the very best work they can, but it would be interesting to see how that reads to me if I could understand the language, and see what feels different, what feels the same, and where they improve it so I can crib that for the next stuff. So yeah, but I can't. Yeah, it is weird to not be able to read the thing that to not be able to consume the thing that you've been a part of creating. But yeah, but still, it's incredibly exciting. And I look forward to seeing those versions out in the world because it's crazy to think that somebody halfway around the world could be reading this in their native language so they can appreciate it as fully as possible. And that's just a wonderful thing. So yeah.
I would be so tempted to do that thing where someone takes like an English paragraph, puts it through Google Translate, and then does it 6 times back and forth. So it goes from like he was stabbed in the heart to his blood pumping orifices was punctured.
Oh no.
Well, there's some funny translations out there. On Instagram, I follow different when someone's tagged me in it and it comes up with like the Russian word for Kings of the Wild or whatever. I'll follow that tag so I can see if someone posts a picture of it or something like that. And I'm pretty sure in German, Kings of the Wild translates to Kings of Darkness, but in Russian, it seems to translate into Kings of Creepy.
Nice.
It's just called Kings of Creepy. Every time I use the auto translate function, that's the title.
So I had a rather long question from a patron here that has like a story behind it, but I think it's an interesting story, and I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts. So my Nana always told me the key to writing was to give the reader everything they needed to see, touch, hear, and smell the surroundings. She demonstrated that to me by writing her memory of standing on a hill and watching London burn after an air raid in World War II. That lesson has always stayed with me. So my question is, which of those elements did they find most difficult to incorporate into their writing? Is it a seamless, just something you instinctually know how to do, but maybe improve in later drafts? And how much research goes into trying to write something like the smell of sulfur?
I believe Stephen King said this, so if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But the idea was that writing is almost a version of telepathy. And oftentimes you can underwrite a thing and people will default to what they know already. So if you want a sort of a creepy house, you don't necessarily need to talk about how every window is falling down and broken and the grass is overgrown and blah, blah, blah. You can shortcut that by using sort of cues. And what I tend to do is I just go with the cues that would most make me see what I want to see. And then oftentimes, because as human beings, we tend to have far more shared experiences than we even expect we have. A lot of people will be able to connect and cue into that same thing. So you don't need to use all five senses in each individual case, although throughout the piece or the work, you probably want to, or I shouldn't say want, I like to try to hit on as many of the different senses as possible because each different sense can cue you in a different way. So overall point being, I would bet you can underwrite things a significant amount and still have the reader see way more than you would expect them to see.
Nicholas, do you agree, or do you no, I hit all five senses every time and I need to describe them?
Here's what they heard. Here's what they smelled. No, I think that is a great answer. And I think, sometimes if you overwrite something, you can be, robbing the reader of adding their own feelings to that scene. What you said is pretty much exactly right. I think Joe Abercrombie's has a lot of cool, when you had him on your show, he did a lot of his advice about using honesty when it comes to analogies and describing things, and how he'll go back through a scene and gloss over it and add the smells to it, or add the sounds to it, or add how the environment might affect the scene. I think that's kind of a neat way to do it. But yeah, I think, you definitely add your own, pepper your story with your own experiences sometimes, whether it's a feeling a starlit sky gives you, or, how a character deals with loss or loneliness. But otherwise, yeah, I think the reader's going to bring a lot to that story.
So how about writing things you haven't personally experienced? I hope you haven't been experienced having a sword shoved through your gut. So how would you go about writing the sensations, the feelings of being stabbed in such a dramatic, brutal way?
Yeah, I just YouTube it.
Fair.
No, but for certain things, obviously we're so fortunate these days to have things like Google and YouTube. You can look up, how long an injury is going to set somebody back. Or I remember when I was writing a lot of Brune's stuff in Bloody Rose, I wanted to write how a wolf moves and attacks realistically. And so I watched all these wolf attack videos, and I had nightmares for weeks and weeks about wolves. It was awful, but hopefully it worked out well in the story.
And Evan, I know you've done quite a bit of research for things like that in your story. You have a character who dual wields swords, but one of the reasons he's able to do that is he doesn't have arrows flying at him. So I imagine there was a good amount of research into how can I justify him using dual wielding swords, not a shield, and it not resulting in him dying the second he comes across an archer. And so I think you incorporate your landscape where there's not wood to make a bow, correct?
That's right. That's exactly right. And it was because, I wanted to have a certain, in the same way that I forget the movie now. I'm awful at references, but I forget the movie. But I remember someone saying, "Well, why do you use knives?" And it's because I get to get closer. It's more intimate, and you can feel the kill, or whatever that line is. And I wanted to talk about violence in that sort of very intimate, up close way, and to examine that, at least in books 1 and 2, and to examine what that is and how that feels. So yeah, and that's also where I'm more familiar, because I trained in martial arts for years and years. So I'm more familiar with that up close feeling of trying to overcome somebody else when they're doing their very best to do the same to you. And so that's, I'm not a sword fighter. I do not actually understand the proper mechanics of sword fighting, but I understand after hours and hours and hours of doing it, what it feels like to be in a struggle against another person. And so I try to incorporate as much of that and the flow of that, the feel of that, the difficulties of that in the writing. And again, because I wanted the violence to feel more personal, I wanted you to be up close with it. The world is such that long range combat isn't as efficient and doesn't really make sense.
I also have the very obvious question here from a Patreon, and that is that if the main characters from Rage of Dragons met the main characters from Kings of the Wild, who would win?
That's not even a question. It'd be Cal versus Ganelon in the end. Everyone else would be dead.
Yeah. Fair. I will leave that up to the comments side. I won't make you guys go head to head.
I feel like that final combat, that's where it would be. That's where it'd go. And then
oh yeah, it'd just be like flurry of swords. Yeah. It'd be over pretty quick for the rest of the boys in the band. Maybe the Bloody Rose crew could hold up a bit longer, but and your fight scenes are amazing, Evan, by the way. Like they're just absolutely incredible. There's obviously a lot of them, and a lot of books I tend to gloss over the fight scenes because you know what's going to happen. But in yours, you tie the stakes of the entire story into the fight scenes, I find, and none of them are just wasted. They're all incredible.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. And it's been interesting because, you kind of, you want to dance with the one who brung you kind of thing. And in book 2, there is definitely I'm interested in talking about violence and the after effects of it and the pre-effects of it. I'm interested in that. But in book 2, I wanted to try and explore as well how other types of violence, how it's not just that sort of purely physical combat, but the other types of violence that come into play that sort of disrupt a society. So you definitely came and I can't make that past tense. Danced with the one who brung you. I don't know. I still dance with the one who brought you, but I wanted to try and expand and explore. So hopefully people enjoy that as much as well when they get to it.
So you danced with everybody and then went home with the one that brung you.
Thank you. Pretty much.
So I've actually seen the label thrown on to your work, Evan, of its military fantasy. A lot of people call Rage of Dragons military fantasy. Is that something you intentionally thought, I am writing a military fantasy tale, or is that just a label that's come along after the fact and you're like, okay, yeah, sure, military fantasy and roll with it?
I think more the second, more the latter, sort of military fantasy and roll with it because I've never been in the military. So it's a weird thing where I wouldn't almost want to be like, I'm writing military fantasy when I haven't had that experience in a way. But I do the research that I can to try and tell the parts of the story that I'm telling as authentically as possible without actually having had those experiences. And I'm happy that a lot of people who read military fantasy seem to enjoy it and connect with it. But I guess, and I'll embrace that as a label or as an idea of what I'm doing. But again, without that background, it's hard to know how. I don't go into super deep tactics and like fortifications and military movements, maneuvers. I don't do that much of that. So yeah, it's odd. Genre labels are tricky, right? Like, I mean, Nicholas, what's the most common label that you get? And is it what you expected?
Yeah, comparisons to Terry Pratchett, which are never good because it's never going to live up to the hype. It's ironic because I'd never read a Terry Pratchett book before I finished mine. Mine was edited. Mine was edited and like almost about to come out, and I picked up. I think I read The Colors of Magic, Guard, and I forget which other one right off the bat, like 3 in a row. And I was like, oh, yeah, this is great.
And actually leads me into another question I had for you. So you have Moog, who I wouldn't say rides into absurdism, but definitely has some more elements that are chaotic in the story, I'd say. And it's really difficult, and from what I've been reading and trying on my own, to write more absurd elements, characters who kind of just go outside the box, not being directly fourth wall breaking. Did you do a lot of research in how to write a character like that? How did the Moog specifically come into existence? Because he's a fascinating character.
Well, Moog he evolved between the first draft and the second draft a fair bit, but he's always been humorous. Like, he was the kind of character that was if I had anything that was too ridiculous for anyone else to say, Moog could say it and get away with it. Or at least try to get it past an agent or an editor or something like that. And then the same goes for Roderick in the second book. He isn't maybe as outrageous as Moog, but he's my conduit for the absolute like craziest jokes I can think of. And then I have a character in the third book that's the same. But Moog in the second book, he did evolve only because, or in the first book, I should say, he didn't have the rot the first time in the first draft of the book. And I think that adds a whole kind of a tragic immediacy to his character and a poignancy to his humor that makes him a better character, after that part of him evolved.
I've also seen you respond to the criticism that there's no point to Moog being gay with what there doesn't need to be a point for Moog being gay. So I appreciate you doing that, because that is something more people need to say. And thank you for writing in a character who so well just is that, and it's not his entire defining characteristic. He's also 5 other badass, awesome things about him.
Exactly.
So that's great.
Yeah.
And, is there anything you guys are currently reading right now you'd like to throw some recommendations out? I always want to give, like, what is on your current, plate? What are you enjoying? I know, Evan, you've been doing a lot of Joe Abercrombie recently. Is that still what the vibe has been?
Yeah, well, I mean, the last audiobook, it's been a couple weeks or days mean nothing, so I have no idea if it's weeks or months, I guess. But I did listen to A Little Hatred on audiobook, and that was fantastic. Like, I mean, and again, it's Stephen Pacey who's reading it, who's narrating it. And it's a work of art to listen to Stephen Pacey do a book, and so it was a lot of fun to go through that and experience it that way. To the point where, and I feel almost maybe I feel bad saying this, but to the point where, like, I started reading, and then I went to the audiobook, and then I went back to reading, and I was like, my brain isn't as clever as Stephen Pacey's version of this. I have to go back to the audiobook to finish it. Yeah. Like, I actually was like, no, I'm going to finish this on audiobook, because, like, I was sitting there and I had time to sit there and read. I started and I was like, this isn't as good because I can't do the voices like he does. So I went back to the audiobook and finished it that way. Yeah.
I can. A Little Hatred is fantastic. How about yourself, Nicholas? What's been on your recent reads?
Well, I've never listened to a Joe Abercrombie audiobook. Now I kind of want to.
Yeah, do it.
I read them all. I mean, I do the voices. I mean, myself. I'm listening to a book called Stormblood by Jeremy Zoll, and it's great. It's awesome. It's kind of like Mass Effect meets Altered Carbon. I got a feeling, I could be wrong, that it's also narrated by Stephen Pacey. I might be crazy here, but I think it might be. Anyways, it's fantastic. I'm almost done it. And then I'm reading a book called Queen of the Conquered, which I asked Obert for a long time ago, and I'm finally just reading it. So it's by an author named Kaysen Callender, and it's kind of about, it's like a colonialism Caribbean story. And I'm reading it with an ex-girlfriend and dear friend of mine who's from Guyana. And so, yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's where my parents are from.
Nice.
All right, and you guys can check out Kings of the Wild, Rage of Dragons, Bloody Rose, and Fires of Vengeance soon. Right now, I think there's pre-order links for Fires of Vengeance, so everything's available. I'll have purchase links down below, and thank you guys so much.
Thank you very much for having us.